All right, so going into the 1970s, the United States was fighting in Vietnam and had backed foreign dictatorships and a lot of different types of governments in relation to the Cold War because they wanted to stop the spread of communism. And they felt desperate to stop that spread, really almost no matter what. No matter what kind of foreign governments they had to support to do it. And U.S. foreign relations get pretty murky in the Cold War, especially in regards to the idea of democracy or freedom versus dictatorship, especially when the United States proclaims very frequently that the Soviet Union is a horrible dictatorship, communism destroys people's economic freedom, so it has to be resisted throughout the world, and then the U.S. starts backing anti-communist dictatorships in different parts of the world. So it's in a lot of ways an interesting and kind of strange look at U.S. foreign policy, and a lot of these kinds of things continue today, very obviously. But by the 1970s, the United States starts undergoing major, not just domestic political problems that we talked about last week with corruption and abuse of power under Nixon, but also national economic problems in a lot of different ways. And we're going to go through those first, and then talk about the internal political kind of dynamics, especially in the presidency and regarding foreign policy with the larger Cold War world. So the 1970s, especially the mid to late 70s, is seen as, in the Cold War at least, the really bottoming out of U.S. international power, where the U.S. does not seem capable of pushing events in the direction that the American government wants it to go. The U.S. seems to be losing control over its role in the world. And there are many scholars and many people just out in general American society and throughout the world that question if the U.S. still has the capability to lead the anti-communist movement throughout the world, or if maybe the U.S. would collapse economically and then the communists would win the Cold War. So there's a lot of those types of fears going around in this era. Some of the economic problems, at least, going into the 1970s were a direct result of some of the economic policies of the U.S. government even in the 1960s. Remember, the buildup for the Vietnam War on the U.S. side started in about 1965. And the U.S. government has to start spending a lot of money to build up the amount of troops that they will eventually send to Vietnam, eventually about 500,000. And that cost a lot. One of the problems with spending that money is, especially in the late 60s, they did not also increase revenue to pay for it. So they borrowed money to pay for the increased troop movement and a lot of other things that the U.S. government's doing. And the late 60s are really when the United States starts spending more money than it takes in on a yearly basis. So you start getting what we call yearly deficits, which means literally they're borrowing money in order to pay their bills because they're not making enough revenue on a yearly basis through taxation. That gets even worse in 1969 when President Nixon comes into office, and he was backed by a whole lot of wealthy groups because he promised tax cuts for the rich. And when he went into office, he delivered. So he cut taxes on the wealthy a little bit, which of course decreased tax revenue, and he was increasing the bombings and whatnot. So that wasn't a very good calculation for fiscal health. But the yearly deficits continue, from the late 60s all the way to the late 1990s. So it's about 30 years of annual, yearly going into debt, further and further into debt. There's a lot of Americans who worry about that in the late 60s because the U.S. had run budget surpluses basically since the end of World War II. So they'd been making more money and paying down the national debt ever since the end of World War II. So when they start going back into deficit, there's a lot of kind of doomsday kind of predictions that if the U.S. continues doing this, there's no way they'll ever be able to pay off the debt. But when you look at what the debt is today, going into debt this little amount compared to today is somewhat laughable. People are being worried about this kind of movement upward because when you get into the 1980s and 90s, you start seeing it go skyrocketing. So the fiscal policies are somewhat short-sighted by the late 60s going into the 1970s. So that's one source of U.S. economic problems on the government level. On the general population level, other things start to happen. OPEC, a group of countries that export oil, oil-rich nations who dig raw oil out of their ground and then sell it on international markets. A lot of those countries get together in 1960 to create basically an oil monopoly, or as much of a monopoly as it could possibly get. They tried to basically unite their export strategies, because they realized in the 40s and 50s, and even going back a little bit further than that, that they had been taken advantage of by Western countries. When a country or companies in the United States or Britain or France or Germany, when they wanted to buy raw oil to make into gasoline, mostly gasoline, they would go to one country and ask for prices, and then they would also go to another country in the region, mostly in the Middle East, to ask for prices. And whichever country offered them the lowest price, Walmart theory kicks in, they go for the lowest price. So in 1960, a lot of these countries decide to get together to sell their oil for the exact same price. And this group becomes known as OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum, which is a kind of European-esque term for oil, exporting countries. And here's a world map of where many of the original members are located. And you can see there's a cluster of them in the Middle East and North Africa, the oil-rich nations of that time and even today. Venezuela, another couple come in from South America, and Indonesia. So they come together and they agree with each other to not undersell each other, to basically not Walmart each other out of existence. So they're going to sell their oil for consistent prices, and if the purchasing companies or countries or whoever cannot find a better price in any one country, then they can slowly raise the price, right? Because there's very little competition. The buyers don't have any other choice, or they have very few other choices. So this group is announced in 1960. They continually add to it, even going into the 1970s. And they start really raising the prices in the early to mid-70s. Americans had gotten very used to having very cheap oil in the 1950s. Very cheap gasoline. You could buy for literally under $1 a gallon. And sometimes, in certain instances, certain years, even under 50 cents a gallon. And that's why in the 1950s you get these massive cars that get like 8 miles a gallon, right? Because no car purchasers are really worried about the price of gas. And when OPEC starts raising its prices, a lot of things that you buy in the store have to be shipped through plane, through boat, or through truck to get to the store where you're actually buying it from. So when you see the price of oil, and therefore the price of gasoline goes up, the price of transportation in general goes up, which means the price of delivering goods to stores from warehouses goes up, which means the price of almost everything in society goes up when they raise the price of oil. And you can see that very clearly when you see the price of energy, which is generally oil, gasoline, starts to spike or even go down. You see the price of American consumer goods also going up in direct relation. So it's a very close connection. And you see the major spikes, of course, happening in the mid to late 70s. And especially in 1975 and 1976, OPEC decides to implement an embargo against the United States, basically refusing to sell oil to U.S. markets in order to drive up the price and convince the Americans that they're going to have to pay more than the pittance they've been paying for decades for Middle Eastern, especially oil. And that's when gasoline becomes much more rare in U.S. society. And if you talk to a lot of your parents, or I suppose even grandparents, if they lived here in the 1970s, they will remember that you couldn't just go buy gas whenever you felt like it. When you went to buy gas, sometimes you'd have to wait in line for hours. And the prices skyrocketed. And this is all happening just within a matter of months. Eventually to the point where in California and in many other states, they pass laws where you can only buy gas on certain days of the week. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you can only buy gas, I think it was on Monday or Wednesday or Friday. If it ended in an even number, you can only buy gas on Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday. To literally try to reduce the lines, because people would sit in these for hours. People have to be at work. They have things to do. They don't have time. So a lot of Americans get very frustrated with the U.S. government because it seems incapable of solving this problem. So the Nixon, Ford, and later Carter administrations that don't have many answers for this, because this is a problem that's been decades in the making the American economy so reliant on especially cheap gasoline and people buying cars that are not efficient in the least. This problem had been created over decades of policy, and the politicians who are in office when the problem really becomes a catastrophe, they just don't have many quick solutions to solve the problem. That's the bare facts of it. And the politicians in office, of course, get blamed for it. Let's see. So, questions about any of this so far? The U.S. economy is estimated even today to be about 25% reliant on the auto industry. So when you start having problems with cars and purchasing of cars and parts and things like that, you tend to get general economic downturns, which were made even more powerful because this is a new world in the 1970s. A lot of U.S. prosperity, economic prosperity, was built on the fact that Europe and Japan had been annihilated in World War II. So if you wanted to buy something that was made in a factory, you largely bought stuff made in American and Canadian factories. That was the bare fact of it. But this is getting to be 30 years later. Particularly Western Europe had been rebuilt with American government help through the Marshall Plan. Their industry, their factories, their employment base, their industrial capacity had been rebuilt, and also in Japan. So their economies are growing again, and therefore there's more competition for industrial products throughout the world. The world population, even the American population, has other alternatives that they can buy from. They don't just have to buy from American companies. So there is a kind of economic leveling out. The United States, even still to this day, is the largest economy in the world. But in 1945, it was by far the largest economy in the world. At the end of World War II, even American foreign policy makers understood that the United States, the American population, owned about 50% of all the remaining wealth in the planet. Just that 5 or 6% of the human population owned 50% of all the wealth. Today that has gone down to 25%. So American prosperity in relation to other world populations has been cut in half. And a lot of this really started in the 70s. It became very obvious in the 70s. So there's a lot of questions whether the American economy can still be the engine of prosperity that could fight against the Cold War and fight against the Soviet communist spread or influence or whatever you want to call it throughout the world. The Americans realized, foreign policy, fairly quickly in the 1950s, that the United States was not the only country that would have to be capable of fighting a Cold War or even the outbreak of World War III if it came to that. So the American government started helping, especially Western European countries, build up their military power, even by helping them obtain nuclear weapons by the 1970s. So in the 50s and 60s, countries like Britain, France, China, eventually West Germany is just kind of given weapons, nuclear weapons by the United States. But you see also a political and military starting to level off. The United States military is still obviously the biggest, most powerful in the world today. But especially the West Europeans are starting to build up again. So there's not a clear, obvious, kind of perfect, complete reliance on American economic and military power. That leadership is starting to fade in the 70s. And a lot of Americans question if, this is the end of the country maybe. Or at least the end of U.S. leadership in the world. And with the spread of nuclear weapons especially, the Soviet Union really started their big build-up in the 60s. These numbers are not completely accurate. These are supposed to be the amounts of nuclear weapons that each side had in the Cold War. So you see in 1945, the United States had like 5, 10, so numbers are pretty tiny. But they started their build-up in the early 50s. So to about by 1960, the United States had about 1,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviets didn't have nearly as many, but they portrayed themselves as having, because if your enemy has bigger weapons than you, then they can attack, right? They feel they have an advantage, so they attack. So the Soviets in the 60s started their massive buildup, while the United States was basically throwing its money away in Vietnam, trying to eradicate communism in Vietnam, which eventually fails. So when the United States military is focused on Vietnam in the late 60s, the Soviets are focused on building up what we call nuclear parity, which means equality. To the point where by the late 70s, the Soviets even built beyond the amount that the United States had. And this became very scary stuff when it becomes generally publicly known throughout the world that each of these countries, by about the mid-70s, has somewhere around 15 to 20,000 nuclear weapons. I mean, in the 1950s, they were afraid of a World War III that could wipe out most major cities and populations in the Northern Hemisphere. By the 1980s, they start talking about eliminating all life on the planet. And this is just 2 countries. And other countries are obviously building up. So these numbers are not perfectly accurate, but it gives you a general kind of understanding of how many they eventually had and when the buildup happened, and when you start getting the cross between the 2 graphs, the 2 lines, where they start to really merge. And that caused so much fear, not just in the populations, but in the American and Soviet governments, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both sides really sat down and said, we cannot be at each other's throats that closely all the time, because that could lead to, a massive kind of human catastrophe. And this could be mass murder of billions of people. So in about the mid-60s and going forward into about the early 80s, you get a general feeling between American and Soviet foreign policy leaders that secretly they have to come to an understanding where they're not going to attack each other. And that the Cold War starts to thaw out. It starts to get more calm in the late 60s especially. And we generally call this, historians generally call this détente, which is a French term which means the easing of tension. So they're not always completely ready to attack each other. They start calming down very generally. They start signing military treaties with each other to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that they'll build, to eliminate the possibility of what we call missile shields, which means if your enemy attacks, you supposedly have like this shield that will defend you somehow, which eventually is not very possible, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. You get test ban treaties where they agree that they will no longer test nuclear weapons, I think they say, in the water, in the atmosphere, or in space. So basically, if you're going to test a nuclear weapon, you do it far underground to try to limit the environmental impact. So does that make sense? The idea of détente. It's a ratcheting down of tension to the point where no little crisis somewhere in the world is going to cause World War III and the possible absolute destruction of at least both of those countries. And Nixon was a surprising leader in that, because his whole career had been based on a kind of rabid anti-communism ever since the 1950s. That was what he was publicly known as. To the point when he was inaugurated U.S. president in 1969, the Soviets went on high alert just in case he just launched an attack on Inauguration Day, just because now he could. The Soviets were very afraid of him, but he made it known to them that he was willing to negotiate and make deals the way Kennedy and Johnson had agreed to. So it basically agreed to kind of fight each other internationally through proxy warfare, like in Cuba or in Vietnam or all these other far-flung places in the world, Nicaragua. Nixon was also very adept at exploiting a breakdown in relations between the Soviet Union and China. The split between the Chinese communist leadership and the Soviet communist leadership started to arise in 1956 when Soviet leaders started saying things after Stalin's death that Stalin was like this international criminal and everything he built up is basically evil. The Chinese didn't like that the new Soviet leaders were saying those kinds of things publicly, so there was an argument that over the years very much breaks them apart, so there's no longer a very close relationship foreign policy-wise. There's not many agreements between the Chinese and the Soviets about what they should be doing in the world. And in fact, 1969, they nearly went to war against each other, which a lot of Americans don't know about, a lot of textbooks don't even talk about. And Nixon understood that that was going on. So when he became president in 1969, he went to China and tried to form good American relations with China in order to really drive that wedge between the two major communist powers in the world. And again, he's probably one of the few American politicians that could have pulled that off, because his whole reputation was based on anti-communism. That's how people defined him in the United States. So they weren't going to accuse him of being some kind of pro-communist liberal or something like that, the way they would have maybe talked about Johnson or Kennedy if they had done similar things. So Nixon politically was in a pretty good position to do something like this, and he and his foreign policy leaders at least were smart enough to understand that this could be a great tool for U.S. foreign policy. Basically, divide your enemies. Don't let them unite against you. So Nixon went to China in 1972 in a very famous trip to make sure that, to bring the Chinese leadership closer to the American point of view and ensure that they stay away from the Soviets as much as possible. Let's see. Okay, but Nixon, of course, was forced to resign when he was impeached in 1974. So his vice president, Gerald Ford, became president in 1974. And Ford is only in office for a couple years because there's another presidential election in 76. And much of that election was, and the American polling indicated that a lot of American voters decided on which candidate to vote for, either the sitting president, Republican President Ford, or the Democratic nominee, Jimmy Carter from Georgia. A lot of them decided which candidate to vote for based on the fact that Ford had pardoned Nixon for all of his abuse of power. So it's a very close vote, and Carter, the Democrat, largely wins based on his victory in the South. He was a kind of southern, even kind of quasi-religious kind of figure in a lot of ways. He was governor of Georgia. So he is viewed as a southerner, so the South votes for him much more willingly than Ford was from Michigan, I think. And Carter also wins the more liberal states like Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania. So he got the big states combined with a lot of the small southern states, and that's what tipped the balance in his favor eventually. Let's see. So Carter wins the election of 76 and goes into office as the new president. And he uses this image of honesty and morality to not just attack some kind of morally bankrupt U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War, but also to attack the reliance on oil. So he says the United States will have to do something to break its reliance, particularly on foreign oil, and find other sources of energy. So he gave a very famous speech in, I believe it's about March or so of 1977, his first few months in office. And I want to show you an excerpt of that speech just as an example of the way he talked and what he talked about very frequently. Okay, so that's his call, and he talked about that pretty openly. He's called conservation and the better use of energy and the creation of other supply sources the moral equivalent of war, because he said it would have that much of an impact on the future of the country. He said that in 1977, and he said that it would be a test of the government if they can actually accomplish these things. And very clearly the test has failed, right? And gas prices have gone up, oil supplies have continued to go down, and here we are today with the exact same problem that he talked about over 30 years ago, with no major changes. And he was the president who put solar panels on the White House, and he was laughed at for doing that, and the next president immediately took them off. But it's a symbolic kind of thing, and he tried to encourage people to do it for their own homes, and obviously we're still fairly far behind in doing that even today. So questions about Carter and his beliefs and the transition that he wants to create, or wanted to create. And he talked about this before the major ideas of global warming and the environmental problems of using and relying on oil and coal were very well known. He was just talking about it as an energy source and the future of the country as the future of the American economy. And Carter ran on a platform that was very different from former American presidents and started to implement these major changes, especially in foreign policy. Carter was a religious type of person. He talked about his religious faith very openly. So he's viewed as a very honest person, a very kind of upright, forthcoming. He's not seen as a giant liar like a lot of people that defined politicians, especially Nixon back then. So Carter has the image of honesty and morality, and he talks about bringing morality back to politics, which, to my analysis, is a very strange combination. But he talked about it openly, and his vision for U.S. foreign policy was to change it. He said that the major political problems the U.S. is running into in the world, and especially coming out of Vietnam, is that the U.S. was backing foreign dictatorships, because those dictators promised to not allow communism into their area, into their country. And Carter's analysis was, why are we fighting the Cold War against basically dictatorship by supporting dictators who will resist the Soviets? He says that doesn't make sense. Either way, it's dictatorship, and dictatorship is evil. And he defines it that way. And he says we want to change U.S. foreign policy, or he wants to change U.S. foreign policy, to be more based in democracy and human rights. He says U.S. foreign policy will no longer support dictatorships throughout the world just because they're convenient for the Cold War. He wants to support democracy. And he looks to get rid of support for U.S.-backed dictatorships throughout the world. So Carter says that you don't have to back dictatorships throughout the world if you support the growth of democracy in a lot of these so-called third world places, a lot of these poverty-stricken places. Those populations would be so thankful for the U.S. in doing that they would willingly support the United States in the Cold War and at least keep communist and Soviet kind of spies and whatnot out of their country. So that's his calculation. If you do what's internationally humane, then the international community will rally to support the United States in the Cold War. Does that make sense? No. Questions about that at all? It's a very important idea. And Carter is basically causing a revolution in U.S. foreign policy from the top down. And starts to implement it. A lot of politicians and the American public were very afraid of what Carter was doing, saying if you allow these dictators to be toppled, then the U.S. will lose the Cold War because communists will come in. So there's a massive debate within the United States about the role of the U.S. in the world and what it should be doing in relation to other governments. So the kind of more conservative aspects of the country started viewing Carter as inept, stupid, naive at best, if not possibly in some kind of communist spy who's trying to destroy U.S. power in the world. One place that Carter starts to implement this policy is in relation to Iran. The United States had toppled a democratically elected Iranian government in 1953, had gotten rid of those leaders and brought in a member of the former kind of royal family of Iran, a guy that came to be known as the Shah. And the Shah ruled Iran as basically a king, with massive support from the CIA and other U.S. government sources. And his rule was autocratic and disgusting in a whole lot of different ways. Anyone who complained about him was arrested. Many of them are executed and tortured. So it's a very brutal dictatorship against the Iranian people. And Carter came into office in 1977 and publicly criticized the Shah for doing these things and tried to tell the Shah that U.S. isn't going to allow you to do this anymore. We may stop support for it. Right at a point when the Shah is getting to be an older guy, and he actually gets sick. So right in 77, 78, there is a kind of revolution in Iran that is getting stronger and getting more confident. And by 1979, they topple the Shah. and kick him out of the country. Or they don't want him to leave the country. They want him to stay so he can go on trial for all the crimes against the people. But he flees the country with many of his leaders. And this happens in 1979 after a long process, largely of economic boycott. Iranian workers went on strike, and they destroyed the Iranian economy to kick the political leaders out. A lot of them just refused to go to work for a few days, refused to buy anything for a few days. The new Iranian leaders promised democratic elections, and they did build up some democratic systems where people would vote for their representatives in a kind of parliament, and they would choose a president. So they have those kinds of bodies even now till today. But the religious leaders of the movement, known as the Ayatollahs, retain complete control over the country. They control foreign policy, they control military policy, even right up to this very moment. And because a lot of Iranians quickly recognized that the democracy they had been promised did not really go into effect, a lot of Iranians start speaking out against these Ayatollahs. So the Ayatollahs start literally building up a new dictatorship, which becomes even worse than what the Shah had ever implemented. So the Iranian dictatorship today is brutal and disgusting, and when the people take to the streets to complain, often the army just goes out and starts shooting people in the streets. So basic dictatorship tactics of fear and mass arrest and whatnot. The U.S., you would think that they could run into certain problems, or that the rise of a new dictatorship could be useful even in some ways to the United States in proving that dictatorships are bad and that the U.S. is not backing this new Iranian dictatorship, that they want to back democracy for Iran. But when the Shah got sick, when he left the country, President Carter allowed the Shah to come to New York for medical treatment, which was an outrage in Iran. They viewed him as basically a war criminal. And they asked for him to be sent back to Iran to be put on trial. So when they get word that Carter has allowed the Shah entry into the United States for medical reasons, they storm the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the capital city, and they take a whole lot of hostages. And this is worldwide news, and obviously news in the United States. And this will remain news in the United States for the next year, year and a half, and becomes the major focus of Carter's presidency for the rest of the time he's in office. Because this seems to prove to a lot of people in the United States that you can't do what Carter was doing, allow democracy to flourish and whatnot, and withdraw support for U.S.-backed dictatorships historically, and just hope that the new democratically elected governments, whatever they arise, will be automatically pro-U.S. Iran, with its long history of being dominated by U.S. puppets, they basically wanted independence, and they were very angry at the U.S. for that long history of oppression. So they take the exact opposite view of the United States than Carter would have hoped for. And this seems to be evidence that Carter was wrong in his whole formulation of what U.S. foreign policy should be in the world, and especially in relation to the Cold War. The new leaders of Iran did not form alliances with the Soviet Union. They did buy some weapons and whatnot from the Soviets, but they did not form any kind of alliance. They did not become a communist country. They were basically trying to stay independent and outside of the Cold War, which a whole lot of countries tried to do. Carter demanded the release of the hostages, but he had no real power in the country anymore. And this becomes national news, and this is on the TV sets of Americans every single day for the rest of the time Carter's in office. And there's a general feeling that Carter is too weak or too inept to do something about it. He is not using American strength effectively, and that the fall of U.S. control over Iran and the ability of what are basically a fairly weak country to push the United States around in this way seems to be evidence that the U.S. is falling internationally. It is going into military and economic decline and might possibly lose the Cold War soon. So there's a lot of fear in the United States about not just Carter's leadership, but the relation of the United States to the rest of the world. U.S. power had been unquestioned since World War II up until the 1970s. And now questions are everywhere. So Iran and the hostage crisis tends to dominate the latter part of Carter's presidency. And of course, the people who run against him in 1980 in his re-election attempt harp on this constantly, right? As an accusation that Carter has to be replaced, and that his whole foreign policy idea has to be replaced. And in the 1980 presidential election, Carter is knocked out of office pretty decisively, at least on the state level. And again, you can see that there's a dramatic difference, as we saw just a few weeks ago, between the popular vote, where the Republican candidate Reagan got 50% of the popular vote, Carter got 41%, so there's about 10% difference. But the electoral vote in the many states is overwhelming. Reagan got either a small victory in each state or a large victory in each state, but when you look at the map, it appears that almost every single person in the United States voted against Carter. So Carter won Georgia, a couple other states, but was largely knocked out in what is seen as one of the biggest electoral college landslides in the whole history of the country. So now Reagan's going to go into office, and he's going to have the responsibility of dealing with these problems. Carter's last days in office was spent obsessively trying to strike a deal with the Iranians to release the hostages. They really wanted the hostages released on their watch. They did strike a deal, but the kind of terms of negotiation didn't go very well. So the hostages are not actually released until January 20th of 81, which is Reagan's inauguration day. So it happened just a few hours after Carter officially left office. So questions about any of that at all? No. Perfect clarity. Okay. All right, so what does Reagan want to do? Reagan comes into office making big promises, not just about the United States, but also about the Cold War. He ran as basically a hardcore kind of conservative Republican who believed that the United States is the greatest country ever made, bar none in world history. The United States is the most democratic, the most fair, the most equal country ever. And that the Soviet Union is the exact opposite. They have created an economic, military, and social dictatorship. And he literally, in speeches, defined the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the world. That all evil emanates from Moscow, wherever it exists in the world. It is the result of the Soviet Union and the result of communism. So Reagan goes into office promising to do something about the Cold War and to win the Cold War, to defeat the Soviet Union. When you analyze his ideas and his speeches, it becomes very evident quickly that he literally believed that a lot of these post-colonial nationalist movements throughout the world, like in Vietnam or India or these other places, that they are very often led by communists, and these communists want to form close alliances and close ties to Moscow. That they are part of the communist worldwide revolution to destroy capitalism. Many of them weren't, as we've already talked about. Many of them just wanted to create, universal education or health care for the poor or something like that. But Reagan very much believed in a lot of these 1950s types of definitions of foreign leaders as too close to Moscow or as communistic or something like that. He seems to have believed it right down to his core. So he's going to basically be the anti-Carter. Carter argued to end U.S.-backed dictatorships, to promote international democracy and human rights, and Reagan will do much of the exact opposite. Reagan will bring back support for dictatorships throughout the world as long as they are anti-communist. And his official foreign policy, which over time becomes known as the Reagan Doctrine, is that the United States will support any country in the world fighting against communists, no matter who that support goes to and no matter what kind of governments they build up. And that becomes the official U.S. stance in the world in the 1980s. Okay, moving forward. All right. This is very largely evident, especially in relation to Latin America. The United States sometimes launches invasions in the 1980s of Latin American countries. Sometimes gives a whole lot of money to certain dictatorships in those countries. Sometimes gives military weapons. Anything that it feels is necessary to keep communists out. And that was a long-standing U.S. foreign policy and had occurred going back at least 100 years by that point. But Reagan really ramps it up and literally will hand out favors, support, money, weapons, whatever is necessary at a much greater level than had really happened at any time since the 1950s. So places like El Salvador, Honduras, Panama, even Haiti are intervened in by U.S. foreign policy, sometimes militarily, sometimes not. Just depends on the circumstances of each of those local countries. And the Reagan administration doesn't really seem to mind backing governments that are going to arrest their citizens and torture people. As long as they keep the communists out, they don't really seem to mind much at all. How is Reagan going to actually accomplish this? He pushes through military budgets, Pentagon budgets, that are huge increases from what had been spent, especially in the 1970s, and especially in the wake of Vietnam, when much of U.S. spending during Vietnam was focused on winning the Vietnam War. So once that war ended, military spending went down. Reagan brings that back, raising military spending by 40% just his first couple of years. And that's just what we call conventional forces, which mean non-nuclear forces. Tanks, soldiers, bombs, planes, that kind of stuff. The U.S. already had, about 15,000, 20,000 nuclear weapons by 1980, so he didn't need to have a massive buildup of nuclear power or nuclear arms also. So he focused on the on-the-ground kind of military power in his first term. And again, he has completely rejected everything that Carter talked about, especially the international humanitarianism and the idea that if you support democracy, then other countries will like the United States and will align themselves with the U.S. Reagan and his administration view that as an abject failure, and they look to eliminate it. And they're very successful in eliminating it, because, of course, they're creating the U.S. foreign policy. Reagan does not just build up U.S. military force conventionally. He also creates a response to MIRVs. And these things are called Multiple Independently Targeted Reentry Vehicles. It's an acronym. These were developed in the 1970s. It basically means that instead of having one missile in a tube somewhere in Ohio that you can launch against the Soviet Union and just have one missile fly over the Soviet Union and hit something there, that's not effective enough for scientists by the 1970s. So they start attaching several bombs onto one missile. Does that make sense? So you launch one missile up, and instead of getting one explosion from one nuclear bomb, they will attach up to 20 nuclear bombs per missile. So when that missile goes up into the atmosphere and eventually orbits in space at low levels of space, that missile breaks apart into several different bombs. And through computer programming, they use gravity to basically land on their targets. They did this because if World War III broke out and became nuclear, they were afraid that the Soviets would be able to bomb their missile sites. And if the Soviets are successful in knocking out 95% of American missiles, you're still going to get off about 5% of your missiles. So you want to have as many bombs on those few missiles as possible, right? To still threaten the Soviets into not attacking in the first place. And the theory is that you don't just launch them across the ocean, because the Soviets would potentially try to knock them down somehow. So you send them straight up into space. So by the time they get into orbit, they start to break apart. There's no stopping it. So these missile shields that they had theoretically been trying to develop in the 1970s are mostly aimed at the missiles that fly along the Earth's surface, right? And that's what you still see being used today. These, with the theory that if one country shoots a missile across the surface, then you can shoot your missile and hit it somewhere in the middle and knock it out, if that's possible. Who knows at that point. But if they just launch their missile straight up, you don't have enough time to launch your missile across the whole surface and get to theirs by the time it hits into space. Does that make sense? So but they just reduce the flight time. So there's no way you can knock out their missile because it gets into space and breaks apart. By then it's over. So MIRVs are a very scary thing. And Reagan also, in building up the U.S. military, said that he wanted to find a way to overcome the problem of MIRVs. The Soviets also build these things. So Reagan announces a thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative. He wants to build space stations that will orbit the Earth with lasers, so that when the Soviet MIRVs go up into low orbit, the American space stations with lasers will shoot down those missiles before they can break apart. So for that reason, it becomes known as the Star Wars program, because Star Wars was the big movie about space back then. Or the big series of movies. A lot of foreign policy analysts think that Reagan may have proposed this SDI program in order to distract the population from the amount of money he's spending on all the tanks and whatnot that would be useless in this war anyway, and possibly to distract a lot of Americans from all the dictatorships his foreign policy was backing throughout the world. You know, this is a kind of science fiction kind of thing, and it seems to be science fiction. They spend billions of dollars just trying to draw it up on a chalkboard to see if this thing would actually work. Lasers in space doesn't seem very practical, unless you're into making movies, right? So even to this day, they don't know if you can actually build this thing and if it would actually physically work. But they spend billions of dollars researching it in the 1980s. And the results are pretty inconclusive. So questions about MIRVs or the Star Wars program at all. But these are the extremes that the Reagan administration goes to try to guarantee that the United States is strong, the United States will use its influence in the world, and can defeat the Soviets even in nuclear war. So there's a lot of even fears in the American population in the early 80s that World War III might be right around the corner, because Reagan seems to be pushing in that direction. And you start getting a lot of scary movies about what would happen in a nuclear war, accidents and even planning and whatnot. Yeah.
So it was the Reagan administration that made up the whole thing where it goes into space and it burst, right?
No, that was already created in the 1970s.
Okay, but did the Soviet Union get that idea from us?
They seem to have been doing it right at the same time. And they both have cutting edge scientists.
Okay, so by this time we're both screwed at that time.
Yeah, but they don't go up into orbit and explode. They just break apart. The bombs, the missile goes up, it gets into orbit, and the bombs release from the missile, so they just kind of fall with gravity onto their targets.
And neither side had any defense against it?
Nope. And both sides still have these weapons, and there is still no defense against this. The United States under Reagan, especially in one very symbolic place for the Reagan administration called Nicaragua, Central American country, had a long history of the United States backing a dictatorship group in that country that became known as the Somoza dictatorship. Had U.S. support going back to the 1960s. When Carter went into office in 1977, he ended that support for the Nicaraguan dictatorship. And very quickly, when he ended that, a revolution broke out in Nicaragua amongst a group called, eventually, the Sandinistas. And they toppled that dictatorship and kicked the Somoza people. They tried to kick them out of the country, but they keep coming back, trying to fight back. So you'll, over time, have basically a small-scale civil war in Nicaragua between the U.S.-backed Somoza people, and the Sandinistas eventually are labeled communists because they start doing a lot of social programs and whatnot. Some of them are communists. There's not much doubt about that. And they create another government that, because they have to fight off an insurgency of Somoza people, that government becomes pretty ugly for a while also. But Reagan used Nicaragua as a great example of Carter's foreign policy failure. That the new government that rose was actually communist, therefore not going to be interested in aligning itself with the United States. So Reagan comes into office in 81, and he starts supporting the Somoza attempt to retake power in Nicaragua. And he calls them freedom fighters, repeatedly. And he starts secretly, or his administration leaders put it that way. It's never been proved that Reagan knew about this himself. But his high administration leaders funneled support to what they called the Nicaraguan Contras, the guys out in the jungles, fighting, trying to retake power in Nicaragua away from the communists. And eventually they start sending weapons, they start sending money, and they do this in a whole lot of different ways that are hugely illegal. The height of this occurs in 1985, 84, 85, going into 86. And when Congress and the general public start hearing evidence that this is going on, this is all done by CIA types of people, and it's hugely illegal. Congress starts to investigate, and they shut down the supply line to the Contras, and Reagan complains, saying, I will support the Contras until my last dying breath, or something like this. One major problem is that the money they were getting was secret. Any money that the U.S. government spends has to be approved by Congress. Congress had never voted to use that money to give it to the Nicaraguan Contras. So the administration had to get money from somewhere else. And they got that money by selling weapons to the Iranian government, the Ayatollahs. And it appears, according to the evidence, that in 81, the Reagan administration made a deal with the Iranian leaders to give them weapons in exchange to let the hostages go. After the hostages were released, the Iranians just start buying weapons from the United States. And the Reagan administration takes that money and gives it to the Contras. So it's a kind of long circle of all this money changing hands. And it's illegal on several levels. Number one, the U.S. created an embargo against Iran, so no U.S. company was supposed to be having dealings with Iran, much less the presidential administration. Supporting war in another country without the approval of Congress, and it's illegal on many, many levels. So Reagan is even doing illegal things, or his leaders are doing illegal things, and it's pretty well proven in their testimony before Congress. Several of them go to jail for doing these things. So Reagan is using U.S. power in really any way he decides to do, and his leaders decide to do, irrespective of who they have to support to do it. And this is also evident in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon to try to knock out the domestic Lebanon government, to create a pro-Israeli government. The Reagan administration supported that fully, and even sent U.S. Marines into Lebanon to help. Not so much help on the battlefields, but to have an American presence there as a kind of American threat. And those troops were bombed in 1983 at a Marine base in Beirut. So this becomes a very famous thing in the 1980s. One of the new instances where this was a suicide bombing, where Americans feel that they're under attack by Middle Eastern terrorists. And Reagan's response was to withdraw those troops out of Lebanon as fast as possible, because he basically decided that those suicide bombers are out of their mind, crazy, and they're willing to die for their beliefs, so how are you going to fight them off? So he pulled U.S. troops out very, very quickly in response to the bombing. So that's also happening in the Middle East. There's also another major conflict in the Middle East between, this time, Iran and Iraq. Those two countries go to war against each other in 1980 in a war that is probably one of the most bloody, most destructive. Millions of people are killed in this thing in the 1980s. So Iran, even though the United States sells weapons to Iran, the Iranian government is still viewed as an enemy of the U.S. government. So the Reagan administration had to sell those weapons secretly. Another reason they sold those weapons is because the Iranians are fighting against Iraq. And the Reagan administration also sold weapons to Iraq. So they gave supplies to both sides. Why do they want to do that? Because they want to weaken both countries. And the best way to weaken a country is to convince it to go to war and destroy its own civilian population, destroy its neighbors. So the Reagan administration's belief appears to have been to convince Iran and Iraq to destroy each other and therefore reduce both of their powers in the Middle East. So the Reagan administration did sell weapons to both sides, one much more secretly than the other. And at this point, Saddam Hussein is already in power, so you have a close relationship between the Reagan administration and Hussein's government, literally to keep them fighting. So a lot of weapons that Hussein used against Iran and against his own people, and that the Iranians used against Iraq and against their own people, were sold or at least given by the U.S. government throughout the 80s. So that war goes on until 1988 and is just massively destructive of both sides. So questions about that at all? No. Okay. And also moving on. So here's another map of Iran and Iraq in the region. In 1979, there is a revolution in Afghanistan which had gone back years, and there's a civil war in Afghanistan amongst different factions that was going on in almost the entire 1970s. None of the sides seemed capable of winning the war, and one of the sides was the Communist Party in Afghanistan. And in 1979, the Soviet Union made the decision to intervene in the Afghan civil war to allow and to help the Afghan communists win the civil war, because the Soviets feel that that would give them an entrance into the Middle East and possibly an entryway into the major oil powers of the Middle East. So the Soviets, at that point in the 80s, this area known as Turkmenistan was part of the Soviet Union. That country comes into existence after the Soviet Union basically implodes. So the United States doesn't want to see the Soviets successful in any part of the Middle East, because if they get access to oil, that could maybe tip the balance of the Cold War in their favor. So U.S. foreign policy in Afghanistan is to promote and give help to any group that's willing to fight against the Soviets' attempt to basically take over Afghanistan. And the American government very literally gives weapons to anybody who's willing to go off and fight the Red Army. And it eventually boils down to the Soviets had very powerful helicopters that they would fly over Afghanistan and just massacre people and destroy the Afghan resistance. And it came down to the U.S. government giving those Afghan fighters shoulder-launched missiles that could target those helicopters and destroy them. So once the resistance fighters got a hold of those U.S.-made weapons, they started shooting down Soviet helicopters one after another for several years. And eventually, by I think it's 1989, the Soviet Union agrees to leave Afghanistan. So it's successful U.S. policy for the short term, but we all know what the long-term implications of that one were. A guy named Bin Laden is one of many Middle Easterners who are not native Afghans themselves. They come from other countries. But their view is that no foreign power should rule or dominate the Middle East. And Afghanistan was the front line in that war. So Bin Laden said and acted in the 1980s against the Soviets because they were a Western Christian superpower that is trying to invade the Middle East, to conquer the Middle East and its populations for its own outside desires. So Bin Laden and a lot of his followers, or he doesn't have many followers at this point, this is really where he gets famous in the Middle Eastern world, goes to Afghanistan and leads fighting units called the Mujahideen. And they are literally kind of guerrilla fighters. They hide out in the mountains and they wait for a good opportunity to attack Soviet forces. And the U.S. gives these forces the weapons they need to fight. But their fight is largely successful. They convince the Soviets to leave after massive military losses on the Soviet army. So for the United States, at least in the short term, the incursion into Afghanistan, which is entirely secret at that point. It doesn't become very well known until the 1990s. It's very successful in the 80s, but of course we know the long-term repercussions of that one. So Reagan is overwhelmingly reelected in 1984. He is the guy who talks a tough game, and he appears to back it up. So U.S. foreign policy seems to be re-emergent in the 1980s in establishing its power to fight the Cold War, and eventually in a lot of ways win the Cold War. And Reagan is an interesting figure. He is reelected in November 1984, and when his second administration, his second term starts in 1985, Reagan largely starts turning on his old policies. He starts doing almost the exact opposite in a whole lot of ways. So Reagan is a very interesting kind of transition figure also for the very kind of ending years of the Cold War. Of course, they didn't know it then. But when he starts his second term, he starts talking about reconciliation with the Soviets. He starts talking about making deals with them. Why would he do this when just a year or 2 years earlier he had defined the Soviet Union as the source of evil in the world? Because the Soviets have elected new leaders. There's a younger generation of Soviet leaders that are coming into power in 1985. And a guy named Gorbachev is their major leader of that faction. And they seem to be reformers. And they are the first generation that was not directly influenced by Stalinism, or Stalin personally. So Reagan seems to have seen Gorbachev as a more rational Soviet leader that you can actually work with and create long-term policy with, and make deals and compromises with. And Reagan also seemed to finally understand that the increased military spending was starting to bankrupt the U.S. government. And again, if you look back at the chart of the national debt, I mean, it just absolutely explodes in the 1980s and early 90s. It was $1 trillion in 1981, and it was $4 trillion by 1993. So it literally quadruples within these just few years. And it was very well known, even by the mid-1980s, that the threat of nuclear war would probably destroy all life on the planet, if not just in the blast areas where the fireballs hit. But if you hit those big cities where have all those cars and gas stations and all those kinds of industrial supplies laying around, that they would create massive oil storms, oil fires, that obviously, if this country's devastated, would never get put out. And oil burns a very thick smoke. And by 1983, researchers, especially at UCLA, came out with a theory that if that kind of nuclear war hit across the world, the people who survived the war would probably die because all the smoke would basically engulf the whole planet so that not much sunlight would get through. Therefore, the trees would die, crops would die, you wouldn't even be able to farm anymore. So the food supply would literally disappear within a couple years, and the people who survived the war would probably die of starvation. And that theory is called nuclear winter, a winter that would last year after year after year until the fires either burn themselves out or something would happen. And who knows how many people would be left after that. So the threat of nuclear war, by this point, would probably threaten the lives of about 7 billion people if it spread worldwide. So questions about any of this? No. Okay, so in the 1970s with Carter and going into the 80s with Reagan, and right up to today, you have two radically different, or not really radically, but two very different interpretations of the foreign policy debate between Carter's view and Reagan's view. So in the 1970s, when Carter came into office, he said that if the U.S. stopped backing these dictatorships throughout the world, that would give the United States a moral authority again. That the United States would be seen throughout the world as the supporter of democracy and freedom and equality. And that would win the Cold War. Because if the world populations recognize the United States as the better alternative, the democratic alternative in the Cold War, then they would join the United States and win the Cold War, possibly even overthrowing the Soviet-backed dictatorships throughout the world. The conservative and eventually Reagan criticism of that is that Carter's humanitarian foreign policy allows for the destruction of U.S. backed governments throughout the world, which means that the U.S., in their mind, loses power throughout the world and could eventually lose the Cold War if it continues down that road. So there's two different visions of the implications of that humanitarian, democracy-based foreign policy. And obviously, with the elections we've seen recently, are still the two major fundamental differences between politicians. Another view. A lot of the more liberal foreign policy analysts say, and they had a lot of good evidence for the fact that the Soviet Union is going into a long-term decline that will probably lead to its collapse at some point in the 1980s. Or at least they're declining in the 80s. Who knows when the collapse is going to hit? So they say that the old containment theory of the 1940s was true, and it was happening, and it's leading to that conclusion. That the Soviet economy and the economies that communists had dominated for decades by this point, by the 80s, are so backward and inefficient, they have so little economic growth, that their societies are upset. Their societies are living in poverty, and they obviously don't have a vote to determine their leaders. So the containment theory was just don't allow communism to spread and just wait for the peoples in those countries to overthrow their own governments. Because they hate communism, they hate the Soviets. Even in the Soviet Union itself. And in the 80s, a lot of people start coming forward, economic analysts, statisticians and whatnot, and they say the Soviet Union is already pretty advanced in that decline. So it's only a matter of time before something happens to that country. The problem with, they say, Reagan's foreign policy is he's provoking the Soviet Union. He's threatening it. And their analysis is that whenever you see an injured animal or something lying in the road, the last thing you want to do is go poke it with a stick, right? Because it's defensive, it's worried. It's paranoid with its own survival, and it will attack anyone who provokes it. So they use that analogy to say that Reagan's confrontational foreign policy is very dangerous. The Soviets still have those nuclear weapons. If they are afraid of being attacked, they just may launch a first strike and start World War III. And the people who supported Reagan's kind of confrontational foreign policy say that Reagan is using U.S. moral authority in declaring the Soviet Union to be a source of evil in the world, and saying that the United States is going to stand up against it and start spending the military money to actually do it. And they say that the U.S. military buildup forced the Soviets to keep up, which bankrupted the Soviet government and eventually led to its destruction. So again, two very different interpretations that still are very consistent even today. The Carter-esque kind of foreign policy says that when Reagan got into office, that Reagan is actually pretty hypocritical in saying that he supports freedom and dignity and all those kinds of things, while he is backing dictatorships throughout the world, giving real-world support, physical support, money, weapons, and whatnot to those dictatorships. How can you say that you're supporting democracy while you're backing dictatorships in other places? That doesn't work together. And Reagan's supporters, again, right up to today, say that Reagan's rhetorical attacks against the Soviet Union was a message more to the East Europeans who are living under these Soviet dictatorships. And it is a signal to them that they should be willing to rise up and get rid of that evil in their countries at some point. And to end their just acceptance of those Soviet dictatorships. This is their time. And Reagan traveled to Berlin and famously told Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall and allow freedom and whatnot to flourish. So, right up to this very moment, we have these very different interpretations of the strengths and weaknesses of Carter's idea and Reagan's idea, and they often, very much connect to each other, and they argue against each other. And you see that in foreign policy debate, especially amongst political candidates right up to today.